Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine.
Hello everyone, I'm Troy Moling and thanks for joining us today on Market Journal. Glad you could spend a little bit of your day with us. We've got a good show for you straight ahead. And we're beginning the broadcast today with the March WASDE report. It left U.S. ending stocks for corn, soybeans, and wheat unchanged from last month's report. Internationally, though, corn rose by 1.2 million metric tons and soybeans rose by 340,000 metric tons. Wheat global stocks fell by 3 million metric tons. I spoke with DTN lead analyst Todd Hultman on Wednesday for a closer look at the numbers.
Probably good news is that there really was no surprising shock in the WASDE report for the month of March. All the ending stocks estimates for corn, soybeans, and wheat all stayed the same as what we saw in February. So we're still looking at a very tight supply situation for soybeans and one of the tightest supply situations for corn we've seen in several years. So no big surprises in that report.
And I also want to talk about Brazil's soybean harvest, because I know that WASDE was talking a lot about what's going on internationally, and with the Brazil soybean harvest, only 34% of that harvest complete when it should be over half at this point. And that's not even taking into account any quality issues. Then the safrinha corn planting around 50% complete when it should be about 80. How serious are these numbers? How much of a delay are we seeing?
Yeah, now first of all, I'll say we did have attention on the crop estimates from USDA for Brazil and Argentina. And Brazil bumped up the soybean harvest 1 million metric tons to 134. And if true, that'll be a new record soybean harvest. I'm counseling everybody, though, to take that in light pencil because, as you say, we've got a very wet situation here in central Brazil. The harvest is late, as you noted. We're probably about 2 to 3 weeks behind the normal schedule. And I think there's a real concern that we may lose some of that soybean production, or I should say Brazil could lose some of that soybean production, maybe 2 or 3 million metric tons worth before this all gets harvested. And then the flip side of this harvest we have to keep in mind is we need to get the soybeans out of the way to get the corn planted. So the corn planting, which is Brazil's bigger second corn crop planting, is also delayed, and that puts them in a little more precarious situation where they could be looking at hotter, dry weather later when they're trying to pollinate corn.
And when we talk about U.S. crops, when we talk about South American crops, China always has a role to play in this as well. So where do they stand?
Yes, well, the sales to China have just been off the charts this year. Very strong export numbers for both corn and soybeans, much more than we expected for both of those two. And that continues so far. And so as the export business transitions now from the U.S. to Brazil, with them starting to harvest their big crop, I anticipate China will continue to have a very strong appetite for Brazil soybeans. I do have to say, though, there is one slight blemish to that outlook, and it reared its head here in Wednesday's markets, and that is that there's growing concerns about African swine fever in China and the impact, the negative impact that may have on their feed demand situation. Among China's prices, we saw corn and soybean meal break support here on Wednesday, and that is a slight bearish concern, and really the first bearish concern we've had in many, many months. Otherwise, it's just been a very bullish outlook for both corn and beans, thanks largely to China's demand.
And with all that focus on harvest, on imports, on exports, you know, here at home, we have that prospective planting survey coming up at the end of the month. So do you think we're going to start to see things shift more to domestic concerns?
Well, I can tell you, Troy, that the basis here in the U.S. is very strong for both corn and soybeans. So all the market clues show domestic demand for both of those running very strong. And of course, supplies are tighter this time around. So we get to that prospective planning report. We've got some of the best prices we've seen in about 7 years. And the incentives are high to get a lot more corn and beans planted this year. And I think the prospective plannings report will probably bear that out. My personal estimate is roughly 92 million acres each for corn and beans. I think is going to be somewhere close to the ballpark. And as we get to actual planting time, weather will often determine which way that goes. But I think there's no question that there's plenty of incentive to get planted this year.
And Todd, we haven't talked since you did DTN's Ag Summit a little over a month ago. Is there anything that you'd like to share from your talk at the summit that could help us with our marketing or risk management decisions ahead of spring?
Yes, well, my advice to folks mainly has been I don't think there's any rush to jump ahead and price new crop corn or soybeans just yet at this point. We see both of those prices in nice uptrends, and I think perhaps they have a little farther to go. Now, having said that, we have to weigh that also with the parts of the country you're in. Of course, if you're in Nebraska, you're concerned about those dry conditions. So whether you have irrigation or not is going to relate to just how eager you might be to forward price some of that cash crop. If you don't have irrigation, it might be more of a risky venture to jump out there too early on pricing that crop.
Yeah, when we were preparing for this interview in that email, you said that risk management advice this year is unusual for you. I didn't know if you wanted to speak on that a little bit. Yeah,
well, it's so rare that we start off the year with such profitable looking price scenarios. And of course, it seems to be well supported by the supply situation and the demand that is showing up from China. So I think this is once where time is on our favor, and we can probably let the market play out a little bit before we start taking advantage of those prices.
Thanks to Todd. Next week, we'll be joined by Central Valley Ag's Luke Beckman, so get those questions in. Next up, the U.S. Drought Monitor shows the majority of Nebraska with at least a moderate level of drought. The dryness is making it difficult for producers who have forage management decisions this spring. Market Journal's Bill Dodd caught up with Extension Range and Forage Specialist Jerry Volesky to find out more about grazing and forage management during and after drought.
It's never too early to start thinking about your plans for the upcoming growing season, especially if you've been impacted by drought conditions in the previous year. Plant production in Nebraska rangelands are dictated by multiple weather-related factors. As such, there are a number of key variables producers should keep in mind when cultivating their strategy.
But some of the key things should be things like the projected cattle numbers or stocking rates we're going to use this coming season, as well as the possibility of an extended period for feeding hay. Also, thinking about the level of utilization on our pastures last year, possible culling and weaning strategies, and a pasture use sequence that we might use if we have multiple pasture rotations. Another thing I think one can keep in mind is, with the producer experiences and decisions they made last year when we had some drought conditions, that they could have a look at those and see what worked for them and possibly bring those back and keep those fresh in their minds. For those producers that use multiple pasture rotations, and whether it's just simply like 4 different pastures that they rotate through across the growing season, one very important concept with that is that each year we certainly encourage the managers to change up the sequence that they use those 4 different pastures. So in other words, making sure that they're not grazing the same pasture the same time each year. So if it's grazed in June last year, it might be grazed later in the summer this coming year.
If you have been dealing with drought conditions, you know all too well what the telltale signs of drought look like. However, the long-term impacts should be what you're focused on. One thing that can be particularly damaging when going through drought conditions is overgrazing.
Well, sure. As far as the effect or response of our pastures and rangelands to drought, it's pretty obvious with, of course, with that lack of precipitation, we have significantly reduced plant growth as well as root growth, and that also affects the reproductive ability of these grasses. So sometimes these droughty years will see lingering effects into subsequent years where there's just poor pasture production. We may have, depending on the severity of drought, some actual death loss of some of the grasses. So then we'll have thinner stands and overall less productivity. And so something that is very important, we like to think that our grazing management is always on top of things, but inevitably under drought conditions, we tend to overgraze somewhat. And that combination of overgrazing and the drought can really negatively impact our grasses into the future.
While some producers may be able to rely on carryover forage, unfortunately, due to last year's drought conditions, another obstacle many producers will have to plan accordingly for is the reduced stock of carryover forage from previous seasons.
Sure, and that's very important, the carryover forage. And we can think back or go back to the pretty severe drought, of course, of 2012. But prior to 2012, so that'd be in 2011, 2010, we had some couple of really wet years, and we had a lot of grass production those years before the drought. And then during the drought, many ranchers were lucky to have that carryover forage from the previous years. And certainly, of course, the quality of that forage isn't the best being carried over, but nonetheless, it was some forage. And so as we go into this year, and if we do have dry conditions, keep in mind that most of our pastures last year were a bit more heavily grazed than we would like to see. And so they're not going to have that luxury of that abundance of carryover forage in the pastures.
Overall, in terms of a drought management plan, one thing many producers will place an emphasis on are critical or trigger dates. However, as precipitation rates vary for different pasture and rangeland types and locations across the state, critical date plans and actions can often take several years of records to fine-tune that plan for an individual operation.
And these are dates where one evaluates their total local precipitation up to that date. So on May 1st, for example, they could determine what their total spring precipitation was up to that date and compare it to the long-term average for the year. They certainly, of course, might also want to consider last fall's precipitation and how much soil moisture was there going into the winter months. But with that critical date of May 1st, for example, if their precipitation totals are significantly lower or below the averages, that could trigger a choice of several possible management actions, such as an extended period of feeding hay or culling some livestock. And these actions can account for varying levels of drought.
In these dry conditions, livestock forage demand will more often than not exceed available plant production, leaving producers to make some incredibly hard decisions. With the uncertainty the weather can bring, it's certainly a good idea to have a grazing and forage management plan in place during and after a drought. Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Bill Dodd.
Thanks, Bill. If you'd like more information from Jerry about making a forage management plan during and after drought, we've included a link on the Market Journal website. Moving on, and a new survey being conducted by Nebraska Extension is seeking the input from the state's ranchers regarding grassland conservation programs. Local farmers and ranchers are often left out of the discussion on how these programs look and are administered. This survey is the culmination of combined efforts from several organizations, including Nebraska Extension, Nebraska Cattlemen's Association, Nebraska Grazing Lands Coalition, and the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission.
And there's a lot of farm bill programming, such as conservation stewardship, which is interacting with ranchers in different capacities. And I think we have a really good feeling for how those programs operate generally. but there's specific management actions that are associated with specific payments that we don't always get direct feedback from ranchers on. So this survey is really an attempt to focus in on the rancher, see how they like how certain programs are structured, how the payment levels kind of correspond with what their management objectives are, and hopefully gives us a little clearer picture about how conservation stewardship programs work in Nebraska.
With 22 million acres of pasture and rangeland in Nebraska, Kyle believes directly involving ranchers in the design process could allow a better understanding of how to create programs to enhance ranching families' livelihoods while still meeting many conservation goals.
And what we're really looking to do is figure out how these programs operate in unison with different conservation objectives, that entities like the Nebraska Game Parks Commission work on daily. So we're kind of hoping to find whether there's some natural overlap between these, where certain management actions align very well with certain payment levels. And then we can hopefully pair ranchers who are interested in that action, specifically with conservation entities that are working on the ground with these landowners.
If you'd like to take the survey, head over to go.unl.edu/grasslands. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to Kyle. His phone number is 402-472-6965. His email is ibr@unl.edu. Next up, IANR's Odor Footprint Tool recently took center stage when helping to decide a Nebraska Supreme Court decision. The Odor Footprint Tool estimates the frequency of disruptive odor events around an existing or proposed livestock operation. Information from the tool is then used to determine minimum separation distances that should be maintained and also to aid in where facilities can be built. In the latest case of Aiken versus County of Lancaster, the Nebraska Supreme Court affirmed the rulings of lower courts that a county zoning permit for 3 poultry barns was justified, in part because neighbors would be, quote, free of odor 94% of the time, end quote. Nebraska Extension Ag and Water Law Specialist Dave Aiken says the tool should have a role in future livestock nuisance litigation.
Before we had the odor footprint, people would just come to the trial, and the testimony is, a lot of it is subjective. But here we have something that is much more objective, and it puts actual numbers on what we're looking at. So having something that is more concrete and objective is a new dimension to these lawsuits.
Dave says it's the first instance of the odor footprint tool being used in a case like this in Nebraska, but it's likely not the last.
My personal opinion is that it'll make this odor footprint standard operating procedure. If we have more nuisance lawsuits in Nebraska, both the plaintiff's attorney who is going against the nuisance and the defendant's attorney who is defending the nuisance, they'll both want an odor footprint done so that they can have something specific in terms of the parameters.
If you're looking to start or add to your livestock operation, you can find more information about the odor footprint tool on the Market Journal website. Next up, Chad Dane has experienced a nice run of national rankings in the National Sorghum Producers Annual Yield Contest. Dane farms 3,600 acres in Clay County and placed second nationally and first in Nebraska in the irrigated West category of the 2020 national contest. His yield, you may ask? 208.4 bushels per acre. Dane typically grows sorghum around his seed corn in fields to help meet isolation requirements for seed corn production. But in recent years, he's been pleasantly surprised by the profitability of his sorghum crops. You can read more about Dane's sorghum growing strategies in the March Nebraska Farmer. Time now for weather with Nebraska Extension Ag Climatologist and Market Journal Chief Meteorologist Al Dutcher. Al, it was a good beginning to the week, but we're seeing some changes in the weather. What can you tell us?
Well, Troy, we can't complain about most of the weather we had here the vast majority of this past week with these nice warm temperatures, but you knew sooner or later this had to give way, and we talked about it last week. There was a potential for a big storm to move into the central United States. Exactly what is occurring in the models had a very, very good handle on this system, actually. The first piece of energy moved through on Wednesday. That caught into the northern stream and left the bottom of that trough basically cut off in the southwest, and that's the low we're going to be dealing with. But we've seen a lot of high winds as that front come through, and we've seen some fairly significant accumulating snows up in the northwestern panhandle, and that extended all the way into portions of north central Nebraska. Reports anywhere from 2 to 6 inches was very common. South of there, of course, the high winds, we've seen some fires break out, and we had some wind damage and power line outages. But overall, compared to what we're going to face here for the next few days, those are very calm conditions. So let's get a look at the upper air models and see what we can expect as we go through this next 7-day period. First thing I'll draw your attention to is here's that large upper air low. It's starting to pivot that energy around. So the precipitation is already breaking out in western Nebraska, and expect that only increases a day progresses, and we'll see that spread toward the east as powerful low pressure sits up over the Texas Panhandle. Very slow moving system with it cut off, and that's going to bring a lot of moisture up and wrap it around up against the Rocky Mountains, and we're looking at some significant snowfall. By the time we get into tomorrow morning, that low pressure system hasn't really moved that far to the east. The low pressure is still sitting over the Texas Panhandle, maybe 60, 70 miles. So we're going to see this long fetch of moisture wrapping around. Very moderate to heavy rainfall possible with some scattered thunderstorms also in eastern Nebraska. Significant snowfall accumulations, and we're talking anywhere from 12 to 30 inches depending on where you are in the panhandle. By the time we get to Monday, this low pressure system itself starts to move off into southern Missouri. We still get that wraparound moisture, and that snow starts to spread into northeast Nebraska, and possibly we'll see some of that fill in across southeast Nebraska as the main upper air low tries to push by the region. By Tuesday, we get the cooler air sagging into the region. It looks like we should see an end of the precipitation if the models are correct. Low pressure will line up in Texas with that troughing pattern. We'll see some scattered precipitation around the region, but nothing significant. By the time we get to Wednesday, there'll be another piece of energy moving down the northwest flow that'll merge in with this trough, giving the potential for significant moisture in the central and eastern Corn Belt, and potentially leaving a little bit here in eastern Nebraska as we see some energy come down the backside. We see this little bit of accumulating snowfall across southeast Nebraska. By the time we get to Thursday, we start to see the ridge trying to build in somewhat. We'll start to see a moderation of temperatures, although that could be compromised in western Nebraska with the snowpack, but overall it looks like we'll start to dry conditions out in the central United States with high pressure firmly in control as the main activity of the storm system moves well off into the eastern United States. Very significant moisture at that. And then Friday, another piece of weak energy moves down the backside of this upper trough over the east. That gives us a shot of some light precipitation across eastern Nebraska. That's at this point in time, looks like the best possibilities will be across northeastern Nebraska, less as you get to the southeast. We go farther out into this scale. Next Thursday, the following Tuesday, notice this below normal temperatures over the central Rockies. A lot of that's with the snowpack, but again, we'll have another trough coming in the western United States that might induce some storm activity toward the end of the month. Even though the GFS model and all the other models are showing drier than normal conditions, about the 23rd, another storm system looks like it's going to make its way into the central United States. So overall, if you're going west this weekend, forget about it. But overall, this is a big event and a lot of welcome precipitation for western Nebraska.
Thanks, Al. Finally today, Nebraska is a leader in cattle, corn, and soybeans, but the state's dairy industry does all right too. In the most recent stats from USDA, 1.4 billion pounds of milk was produced each year. And 2021 marks the 135th anniversary of the Nebraska State Dairy Association. Market Journal's Maddie McIntosh spoke with Executive Director Kris Bousquet to learn more.
More than 100 dairy farms call Nebraska home. The Nebraska State Dairy Association, or NSDA for short, was created to promote growth and sustainability for these dairies and the industry as a whole.
So the Nebraska State Dairy Association is a state trade association developed by the dairy farmers over 135 years ago. This year we're celebrating our 135th anniversary. And basically what we do is we work on the farmers' behalf to grow the industry in Nebraska, as well as lobby and advocate for anything that might be of interest of the dairy farmer. We are proud to work on behalf of the Nebraska dairy farmer, and that's kind of what we do for them.
This year, the annual NSDA Convention will take place on March 18th in Columbus, Nebraska at the Ramada Inn. The day will be filled with educational talks, industry updates, and chances to connect with fellow producers.
It roughly starts around 9:30 when our vendors exhibit. 10:30 we've got our first educational session of the day, which is going to be on transition. And so we're going to have a dairy farmer, Bill Teal, as well as Luke Teal and Scott Teal, discuss their firsthand experience about transitioning and just some of their School of Hard Knocks learnings. Moving into the afternoon, we're going to have our dairy checkoff update, and they're going to discuss growing dairy demand in a global pandemic, which is obviously something that's never been done before, and it's extremely difficult. So we're going to learn a lot about what they've done over these past few months. Governor Ricketts is going to be coming at 1:30 to give remarks about how him and his staff are working towards growing the dairy industry and the agriculture sector altogether. And then we have probably our most popular event, which is the ice cream social. All you can eat ice cream starting at 3:30. And once you grab your bowl of ice cream, we'll invite you in to check out the Nebraska Dairy Princess presentation. So that'll be happening shortly after the ice cream social gets kicked off.
The convention will conclude with an awards banquet and will feature keynote speaker Krista Harden, CEO of the U.S. Dairy Export Council. Kris says the dairy industry hasn't been easy lately, but the NSDA will continue to fight for its farmers throughout the coming years.
You know, things are tough, and I think every sector of agriculture is experiencing that. And so we are really putting our foot on the gas pedal when it comes to growth and development of market competition. So we are actively out recruiting dairy processors across the country to move to Nebraska to help diversify the farmers' markets. So it's one thing that we're really proud of, and one thing that we're going to keep working for our farmers going forward.
Reporting for Market Journal, I'm Maddie McIntosh.
Thanks, Maddie. The convention is free and open to the public, but registration is encouraged. To register, visit www.nebraskamilk.org. That's going to do it for this week's show. If you missed a story, be sure to download the Market Journal mobile app or follow us on social media to join in on the conversation. And don't forget, you can get the latest updates on the fight against coronavirus at covid19.unl.edu. And one more thing to note, daylight saving time in Nebraska will begin at 2 a.m. on Sunday, March 14th. So set those clocks forward 1 hour. Hope to see you right back here next week. I'm Troy Moling. Thanks for watching.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.